Hey Tony, it's Friday. And first off, to answer your question of the week, I think my favorite part of U.S. history, pre-Civil War, is probably the lead up to the Civil War. There was just so much. There's so much going on within everything within the world or within the country at that point that really put us on the on the brink and on the path to Civil War. So I think that's one of my favorites just because it's so fascinating to see the differences between the North and South and Manifest Destiny and all of that. So what I actually want to talk about this week is history as well. I'm going to focus a little on a different history. I'm going to do one of the things I like to do, and that is compare the past to the present. So I was reading a really good article the other day on late stage capitalism and the new Gilded Age. So what I mean by both those things is late stage capitalism is kind of an internet meme, but it's also actually a real thing in which the goal for monetary wealth has far surpassed internal morality. And then it's all about getting that bottom dollar all together. So like one thing that you see a lot is good examples in hospitals. In certain hospitals, in certain regards, after a child is born, in order for a mother to actually hold her child, they're charged about $36 or so. So that's what I mean by late stage capitalism, in which that's just something that's just absolutely absurd that is part of our economic system. And I want to talk about the new Gilded Age. So for the historical aspect of it, the Gilded Age was the time in U.S. history that was post-Reconstruction, but roughly turn of the 20th century. So you're looking roughly between the years of 1875 to about 1905, give or take. That is known as the Gilded Age. Now, I'm sure you remember going over that in history, but a little bit of a refresher. It was when there was a massive economic upswing within the country that manifested in industrialization. It manifested in income disparity, and that's where you had your captains of the industry, or the less flattering term that they're generally known by, which is robber barons. That's your Carnegies, your Mellons, your J.P. Morgans, all of those big names, your Rockefellers, all of those big names that were the captains of the industry during the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age itself gets its name from a little-remembered Mark Twain story, actually. That was it was written just before the Gilded Age began, but it really kind of historians have looked back, particularly starting at around the 1920s, looked back on the previous 20 years, I guess really the previous 50 years, and determined that the Gilded Age was really what fit for the name. It was called the Gilded Age, in which everything had a nice shiny gold coloring until you realized it was gilded on top, and underneath it was just, cold black iron. And so it was kind of, the term came as essentially sarcasm, saying that although you see all these fantastic things around you, all these great building projects, how the country is really modernizing, it was just a small gilded covering onto the workers who were really the ones who were being impacted. And there's a lot of parallels that you can draw between the Gilded Age and our modern times, starting roughly around the 2000s. Yeah, probably a little before, probably like late 80s, early 90s, to where we're at today. There are a lot of comparisons that you can draw between the Gilded Age of old and our new Gilded Age. One of the most common ways is just the income disparity. There's been plenty of ink shed on this in which it's just there is a major income disparity between your 1% and your 99%. Back in the Gilded Age, like, double check me on those numbers, but I want to say that the top 3% controlled about 80 to 90% of the income as a whole. Actually, I think it was 75% of a whole. And in our modern world, the top 10% makes more than about the bottom 90%. Just generally comparatively. And so it's really like there are a lot of things that you can draw there. There's another point that you can draw a parallel to, and that is our politics. The politics of the Gilded Age it was right in the days of like the political machine, where it was, vote early and vote often. But it was also a time of a lot of industrialization, a lot of policies that benefited the rich and wealthy. And you can compare that to our modern day, and a lot of our tax policies are all about benefiting your top 5, 10%, and leaving the rest to basically foot the bill for these tax bailouts we're giving to your corporations, your top earners, et cetera, et cetera. So there was one similarity between our politics, but the other similarity is a darker one in which xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, all of that was a huge, huge, huge part of Gilded Age politics. And we see that to this day still, in which you have a lot of xenophobia. I mean, the entire Trump presidency is built on xenophobia, which was strongly reminiscent of several of your Gilded Age politicians. Even for the fact that a wealthy businessman decided to run for politics is strongly reminiscent of the Gilded Age, because your Carnegies, your Mellons, your Rockefellers all held political office. And if they didn't hold political office, they, similar to the Koch brothers, just donated and were able to foot what they wanted through lobbying, through donating, through, for lack of a better term, buying politicians. And see, they're just all real similarities between the Gilded Age of old and our modern era. There's the disparity in housing, in which you had a huge explosion of new buildings, new tenements, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, like the units that we live in here are all Gilded Age buildings. They were old buildings that were probably at one point housed a lot of workers who were able to, just walk to the factories in Springfield or walk to factories in Holyoke, et cetera, et cetera.
Walking to a factory in Holyoke here would suck.
Yeah, but I'm saying like the buildings in Holyoke were old like this.
Yeah, I know, but like I'm just gonna state.
But still, it's like they were able to or get into like carriages that went right through here, et cetera, et cetera. But it's all. The other big thing is the disparity between wages and living expenses. Now, most towns were company towns during the Gilded Age, in which one company owned the entire city essentially. So, say Toledo's a good example. You had the glass companies. The glass industry just owned the town. It was a company town, and so a lot of the buildings were close to those factories that were basically run by the same people who ran the factories. They were the landlords, or they paid the landlords, and basically property management situations. And wages pretty much stagnated. Like there was a huge explosion at first, and then wages just kind of stagnated for most workers, except for your higher ups. And we've seen a very similar example here. Like the buying power of $1 in 1970 is not that far off from where we are now, and that's a solid 50 years later. The power of the dollar has not really changed much. Our wages haven't grown that much, but you can bet our living costs have. And these are all well documented and well written. People are going to explain it way better than I am, but I find it really interesting because of how reminiscent today is to 100 years ago, or 130 years ago, really. And it could make people be really concerned for the future, but it gives me a very small bit of hope, because the Progressive Era was right after the Gilded Age, in which you had so many great things that were created for the country. There were, you were able to help go up against poverty. It helped inspire the New Deal later on. It inspired the Teddy Roosevelt presidency, so it gave us our national parks, gave us our trust busting, et cetera, et cetera. We're already starting to see some actions that are very similar. The example is Congress looking to maybe demonopolize Google, because Google owns most everything that I use at this point, or at least is involved in somehow. So it gives me some hope. So Tony, my question for you is, what gives you hope for the future?
Green New
Tony,
Deal.
see you on Tuesday. Later, bro.